Blue lights bloom in the rear view like a question that knows your name. Your foot eases off the gas, your hands climb to 10 and 2 by muscle memory, and your heart tries to make itself small. Now picture the uniform on your chest, your name, tape, your rank, your country's colors, because you are coming home from work and you have done everything right. Still, fear arrives faster than the officer's boots at your door. Your hazard lights blink as you guide your SUV toward a well-lit gas station, the place your parents told you to pick if you ever felt unsafe. You keep your hands where everyone can see them. You ask calmly, "What's going on?" And the voice that answers you carries the weight of a history you know too well. "Yeah, you should be." Then the hiss and burn of pepper spray, the chaos of commands stacked on top of one another. The realization that a simple stop has become a national story, because the camera on your dash and the ones on their chests refuse to lie. This is the true story of Karen Nazario, a Black and Latino Army officer who was pulled over on a small-town Virginia night, hands up, voice steady, and became the reluctant face of a question older than any one traffic stop. What does safety look like when the people who promise it point guns at your window? It's about the thin line between ordinary and ordeal for Black drivers, about a quote that ricocheted around the country, "Fixin' to ride the lightning, son," and the taste of pepper spray that turned into a lawsuit, a jury, and an appeal. It's also about how a video can be both evidence and mirror, showing a town what it looks like to the rest of the world, and showing the rest of the world what too many communities already know by heart. Windsor sits on the southeastern shoulder of Virginia, a place you might pass on your way to somewhere else. Streets lean into silence at night. Gas stations become islands of light where strangers' faces feel less like a guess. On the evening of December 5th, 2020, Second Lieutenant Karen Nazario drove through that darkness in a newly purchased SUV, a temporary paper tag taped in the rear window. He saw the lights behind him and did what many drivers, especially Black drivers, are taught to do when the road is unlit. Slow down, hazards on, find a safe, well-lit place to stop. He pulled into a gas station canopy, parked, and kept his hands high, out the window, where no one could claim they didn't see them. What happened next did not spring out of nowhere. It rose from a long American history, where the ordinary friction of traffic enforcement has become, for far too many Black and brown people, a site of humiliation, violence, and fear. A record number of police-civilian contacts in the United States begin with traffic stops, and decades of research have shown that Black drivers are disproportionately stopped, searched, and subjected to force. One influential line of research noticed something simple and telling. After sunset, when it's harder to discern a driver's race before initiating a stop, racial disparities in stops diminish. In plain language, when bias can see race more easily, it leaves a heavier footprint. Layer onto that the lived wisdom passed down in families. Keep your hands where they can see them. Narrate your movements. Ask for a supervisor. Stop in the light. These are the instructions for making yourself small enough to fit inside someone else's expectations of harmlessness. For Nazario, a soldier in fatigues, that training flicked. On alongside the headlights, he announced his intentions. He reached slowly. He asked questions without raising his voice. In the months that followed, video of the stop would ricochet across the country. People would argue over the letter of traffic codes, whether a temporary tag in the rear window was visible, whether driving to a well-lit area counted as eluding, whether orders shouted in a cascade were designed for compliance or for failure. Local officials would say later that policy wasn't followed that night. But for those who have lived, with the weight of the stop itself, the facts felt familiar, the fear sounded familiar, and the setting, a small town, a dark road, a bright station, looked exactly like the place elders tell their children to aim for when they need to survive. A moment that shouldn't be dangerous and somehow is. The minutes we are about to recount exist in triplicate, from the body cameras on two officers, and from the cell phone mounted in Nazario's dashboard, unblinking. They do not agree on everything. Cameras never do. But they agree on enough. 2. Officers approached with guns drawn. Joe Gutierrez and Daniel Crocker. Nazario kept his hands out the window, fingers spread. He wore his uniform. He told them he was afraid to get out. One officer's reply, "Yeah, you should be," landed, like a verdict before any charge was named. Commands collided in the air. Turn off the car, put your hands out, open the door, keep your hands outside. Get out now. Step out. Don't move your hands. It is the physics of an impossible test, the kind where obeying one instruction breaks another. In this tangle, Nazario did what many of us have rehearsed in our heads. He asked, "What's going on?" He requested a supervisor. He tried to buy time for sense to return to the scene. He did not swear. He did not lunge. He did not shout. He radiated the kind of compliance that would be called heroic if he were on a battlefield, the kind that says, "I will keep everybody here safe, even you." One officer holstered his gun, drew a pepper spray canister, and delivered a warning. Then came the spray, its hiss and burn, filling the cabin of the SUV, blinding, choking. Nazario coughed and sputtered, still asking why. More commands, get out now. He cracked the door, wincing. He is pulled, pushed, cuffed. At one point, the words that would become infamous enter the record. "You're fixin' to ride the lightning, son." The phrase carries a grim association, electrocution, and falls like a threat layered into an already chaotic scene. To Nazario's later complaint, the words were emblematic of a climate in which discretion had been replaced by domination, where the point was not safety, but submission. As the minutes wore on, and the immediate violence, the tone shifted. Officers discussed charges. They also floated a deal. They could let him go without charges if he would let it go. The subtext was clear enough. In the complaint that followed, Nazario would describe officers who threatened to derail his military career if he complained. He drove away that night without a summons, face stinging, eyes burning, car reeking of chemical irritant. The only reason the world would know his name was because he refused the silent path out, and chose instead to speak into the camera that had already been speaking for him. When the video surfaced months later, it did what only certain videos can do. It synchronized the nation's heartbeat for a moment. Pundits debated tactics and tone. Attorneys argued doctrine. Residents of Windsor defended or denounced. Veterans watched an American service member in uniform, hands up, and felt a chill that wasn't the December air. The Windsor Police Department fired Joe Gutierrez. Daniel Crocker remained employed. The governor called for an investigation. The Attorney General launched a civil rights probe. Windsor suddenly was not a place you could pass without noticing. It was a mirror someone was holding to the country's face. Publicly, explanations proliferated. Officers said they couldn't see a rear plate. Video showed a temporary tag in the back window when illuminated. Officers said he was eluding. He said he was seeking light, as any safety class would recommend. Officers said he wasn't complying. The videos show a man caught in a maze of conflicting orders and a fog of pepper spray, doing more than many could in the same circumstance. If you have never been taught how to survive a traffic stop, you might not recognize how careful he was. If you have, you know he did nearly everything right, and it still wasn't enough. What made this more than a single night was everything around it. In the year 2020, the United States was already incandescent with grief and fury over police killings and abuses. Racial disparities in traffic enforcement had been documented and debated for years. Studies with millions of stops had revealed patterns that did not budge, no matter how the numbers were sliced. The situation in Windsor became an exhibit in a longer trial. Not the criminal trial of two officers, but the moral trial of a system where blackness too often registers as risk. Even in a uniform sewn with the flag, Caron Nazario did not become a public figure by choice. But once the video turned him into one, he chose not to vanish into private pain. He filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the officers, alleging constitutional violations, assault and battery, and illegal search, among other claims. The complaint told a story many communities already knew word for word. The pretextual stop, the escalation, the pain, the threat, the offer to make it all go away if you just don't talk. Filing was the first act of resistance. Enduring the process was the second. Civil litigation is a slow-motion climb up a mountain of paper. Depositions, motions for summary judgment, expert reports, and the grind of discovery can wring a person out. Along the way, a federal judge dismissed some claims and allowed others to proceed. In January 2023, a Richmond jury delivered a verdict that confounded a lot of onlookers. Less than $4,000 in total damages, just $2,685 for assault, and $1,000 in punitive damages for an illegal search. The number looked small next to the video's impact. The math felt disconnected from the pain. Many supporters called it a slap in the face. Others, familiar with the legal standards and the deference often extended to officers, nodded grimly. The law's thresholds are high, and juries are human. Nazario did what resilient people do. When the first answer doesn't match the truth they can feel, he appealed. In May 2024, a federal appeals court issued a decision that split hairs and still managed to matter. It largely upheld qualified immunity for one officer on certain claims, but it also revived a key Fourth Amendment claim against the other, holding that death threats and extreme intimidation, words alone in context, could amount to an unreasonable seizure in violation of the Constitution. In plainer terms, what you say while pointing a weapon at a compliant driver can, itself, be a form of unlawful force. That holding does not erase the burn of pepper spray or the sting of a modest jury award, but it draws a new line in the case. Law, one that future drivers and their attorneys can point to when they ask courts to see the power of words. Resistance didn't stop at the courthouse steps. The video pushed Virginia's leadership to act. The state's attorney general sued the town of Windsor, alleging a pattern of discriminatory and unconstitutional policing that predated and followed the Nazario stop. The lawsuit sought reforms, training, accountability, data reporting, and supervision that would make policy mean something on the night shift. In September 2023, the case settled with the town agreeing to independent reviews of misconduct, officer training improvements, and transparency measures. It wasn't a headline-grabbing payout. It was a blueprint. And blueprints matter because the next stop is always a day away. At the community level, pastors and parents folded the Windsor footage into long-running conversations about driving. While Black, young people learned again the choreography of survival. Narrate your movements, slow down for light, do not reach, ask for a supervisor, keep your voice low. At the same time, advocates pushed back against the cruel arithmetic of survival's burden. How much responsibility is piled on the stopped, while the stoppers are too rarely retrained or restrained. Policy groups amplified reforms Virginia had already adopted in 2021, curbing pretextual stops for minor equipment violations that too often serve as fishing expeditions. The message was simple. If you reduce the number of unnecessary stops, you reduce the number of unnecessary escalations. Pain and resilience lived in the same house. For Nazario, the struggle included the very real prospect of career damage, exactly what was allegedly held over his head that night. For his family, it included the anxiety that comes with attention, strangers' praise and strangers' rage in equal measure. For Windsor's residents, it included shame and defensiveness, pride, and denial. A town's name dragged through the national conversation not because of one man's bad night, but because the cameras had captured something that could no longer be explained away as misunderstanding. There are two climaxes in this story. One, visceral and immediate. One legal and slower than anyone wants justice to be. The first lives in the seconds where Nazario's calm assurance meets the officer's threat. I'm honestly afraid to get out. Yeah, you should be. The power dynamics crystallize there in words that activate centuries of justified fear. Then comes the pepper spray, the sting that will not be argued away, the action that rips a hole in the polite fiction of routine. If you watch those seconds and don't feel your chest tighten, you are either very lucky or not paying attention. This is the private climax that became public. A person trying to make it to tomorrow. A uniform that should have made him safer and did not. The feeling that we are one wrong glance away from grief. The second climax is procedural and easy to miss if you don't speak the language of courts. When a federal appeals court recognized that certain extreme threats and verbal intimidation, coupled with weapons, authority, and context, can violate the Fourth Amendment, it carved new doctrine into the granite. It said in essence that the Constitution is not only about where your hands are, it's about what is done to your mind and body by the state's power, even when that power takes the shape of words. That doesn't read like a movie scene, but it's the sort of law that changes outcomes for people who will never make the news. Between these two peaks flows a valley filled with a jury's number, 3,685. The public wanted a different dollar, sign to match their sense of what was right. But the story's meaning isn't chained to a check. The footage itself moved governors, attorneys general, and police chiefs. It fired an officer and forced a town to rewrite its protocols. It threaded itself into kitchen table conversations and briefing rooms. It pushed Virginia to defend its reforms against rollback attempts. It became a training film for officers who want to do better, and a warning for those who don't. In Hope Corps Stories fashion, the real climax is the social awakening that comes when enough people see at the same time what has been happening all along. Suddenly, the advice Black parents give their children is not myth or melodrama, it's survival liturgy. Suddenly, pretextual stops and odor-based searches look less like public safety and more like pretext to exert control. Suddenly, someone in a legislature moves a bill that would have sat on a shelf a year earlier. Suddenly, the country remembers that public safety is measured not only by crime rates, but by how safely you can drive home from work without swallowing your dignity or risking your life. The long tail of this story is where its power consolidates. The officer who said the words everyone remembers is no longer in uniform. The other officer stayed on the job and became, for many, an emblem of the system's stubbornness and its capacity for reform. The town of Windsor agreed to policies that, if followed, can prevent the next escalation from ever taking shape. The Attorney General's lawsuit did not end with a splashy number, but with commitments measurable in practice. Training that sticks. Supervisors who intervene. Complaint systems that don't bury truth. For Nazario, the resolution is both public and private. Publicly, he helped shape appellate precedent that will outlive this news cycle. Privately, he carries the weight anyone carries after a night like that. The startle at a siren, the ghost of sting around his eyes when he thinks of that December air, the knowledge that a uniform is not a shield from suspicion. The cameras turned him into a symbol, but symbols have to wake up, go to work, and live inside bodies that remember. He is not an issue. He is a person who wanted to get home without incident, and instead found himself in the middle of one, where the rest of us, the resolution takes the form of choices. Police command staffs can train for de-escalation as if it matters, because it does. They can write policies that make stopping in a well-lit area presumptively reasonable, not suspicious. They can limit the use of pepper spray to contexts where imminent threat justifies it, not confusion. They can track data and publish it, so the public can see whether disparities shrink or grow. Legislators can resist rolling back reforms that reduce unnecessary stops and needless searches. Courts can continue to refine the doctrine so the Constitution protects not only the technically compliant, but the clearly intimidated. Community members, too, have a role beyond retweets and outrage. Every parent who teaches a child how to survive a stop is doing both tragedy prevention and democracy repair. Every neighbor who shows up at a council meeting to ask about stop, data, or complaint investigations is doing public safety. Every driver who insists on dignity while cooperating, and every officer who insists on dignity while enforcing, moves the needle. This story resonates because it lays bare the daily moral math of a multiracial democracy. Do we believe safety is a shared good, or a privilege granted to some and gambled by others? Do we accept that the burden of not being killed or humiliated during a stop should fall mostly on the stopped? Or do we move the burden where it belongs, on policies, training, culture, and supervision. What do we learn from blue lights in a rear view and a camera that would not blink? That safety without dignity is not safety at all. That courage is not always a sprint into danger. Sometimes it is the stillness of hands out a window, the calm repetition of a question, the willingness to reach for a supervisor instead of a fight. That words can be weapons and that the law is finally, slowly, learning how to see that. We also learn that the smallest decisions can rescue or ruin a night. An officer's tone, a command phrased as an invitation to comply rather than a dare to resist, a pause long enough to parse the reason a driver kept his hands up. These are the difference between de-escalation and disaster. We learn that a jury's number does not measure the size of a wound, nor the reach of a video. We learn that reform can come not only from the top-down press conference, but from the bottom-up courage of someone who refuses to let a story die on the shoulder of a road. If you are a viewer, here is your call to action. Learn your rights. Teach your children both their rights and the scripts that keep them breathing. Show up to local meetings where policies are written and budgets assigned. Ask your police leaders how they measure dignity, not just arrests. Support reforms that reduce unnecessary stops and increase transparency. If you wear a badge, do the work that honors the oath. Slow the moment down. Meet calm with calm. Treat the person in the seat as you would want your family treated in theirs. The footage made him famous. But the fame is not the point. The point is whether the next pair of blue lights in the night carries a promise or a threat, and whether we can, together, write an answer that does not require a camera to be believed.